My guest today is Megan Bloomgren from the DCI Group here in Washington, D.C. Meg, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. Before we start into the deep stuff, I'm always fascinated by people's background. How did you end up coming to D.C. in the first place?
It's a great question, and I think it's probably not unlike most people in Washington. I started on political campaigns, and I'm from Philadelphia originally. I have the grit and the Catholic guilt to prove it. And I was there at college at LaSalle University, and my senior year, the summer between my junior and senior year, the GOP convention was in Philadelphia. And so I had been doing some political campaigns, and I had the opportunity to do some fundraising, and I found myself on the floor of the convention floor, and soon volunteering to drive in a motorcade for the recently announced vice presidential candidate, Dick Cheney. So that brought me to Washington later on when he and President Bush won, and the rest is kind of history.
Now, you've had a bunch of positions in not only in government, but in trade associations too. Tell me a little bit about that.
So when I came to Washington, I actually worked for Accenture just before they IPO'd, and I stayed engaged with the government. I didn't take a job in President Bush's first administration, but I had an opportunity to go on after the inauguration in the second term to work at the Environmental Protection Agency. And so I learned the alphabet soup of regulations. What are the good side of them and the important public input? What are some of the drawbacks? I was at the White House during Hurricanes Rita and Katrina. I went to the Department of Energy, which I call the Department of Everything. And it's such an interesting place to have been because they do everything from Cold War era nuclear waste cleanup to nuclear weapons to the crown jewel of the national labs. And after that, I guess, PhD, if you may, in the opportunities in government, I went on to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the largest business consultancy and or business advocacy group. And that was just before President Obama, or at the time, Senator Obama and Senator McCain, when they were kind of battling it out. So we did a good bit of energy policy work there. And it was a time where climate change was a really important topic. It continues to be. And we had climate activists scaling the building and satirical activists staging a press conference to say that the chamber had changed their position on a piece of legislation that actually was set to reduce emissions here. And the United States actually since then has reduced emissions to here because of the market forces at work and the importance of natural gas. So anyway, yes, I've had some neat opportunities. I realized at the chamber that in order to be able to work with consultants and use them to your advantage, it was important to be one. And I came to DCI Group in 2011 and just was amazed at all that there were possibilities to change in the public affairs space. So, DCI was run much like a political campaign, so it was kind of like home. We had the media and pitching side, the research and messaging, the paid media, the strategic alliances and coalitions, and the talent blew me away. So I spent a number of years here, went a little bit deeper in the energy side, went to the American Petroleum Institute and ran their communications for 7 years, and now I'm back at DCI because I really believe in the work of public affairs and in shaping policy outcomes.
When you talk about energy, the world has changed dramatically. In that little window of time that you just talked about, what are some of the challenges that the United States faces right now when we talk about energy?
Yeah, it's kind of whiplash. When I was at the Department of Energy, oil hit $100 a barrel. When I was at API, oil prices went negative during the pandemic. When I was here at DCI the first time, we were talking about importing LNG. And there's been a dramatic transformation with independent producers producing so much natural gas here that we're actually exporting it and helping the rest of the world. So I actually see more opportunity than I see challenges for energy. I think the American people believe and understand more and more the importance of producing our resources here. We've got, resources that are the envy of the world from an oil and natural gas perspective, a coal and uranium, and even in the renewable space, given the wind in the Great Plains and some of the sun out west. And so, I'm bullish about the future as it comes to energy. There's 8 billion people on the planet today. There's set to be 10 billion by the time my kids are out of college and having children. And so I've found, I'm a lifelong learner, right? And this has just been an incredibly dynamic period for energy.
You mentioned a couple times the first time you were at DCI. Let's talk about that. What was your role specifically when you were here in 1.0?
Good question. So DCI is an independent, probably one of the most respected public affairs firms. It's been around 30 years, has 100 employees. Most of the office of those 100 are here in Washington at 20th and K, but we have an office in New York and in Florida, and also a big office in Brussels, actually. And the first time I was here, I came in out of the US Chamber and did a lot on the financial services side, did a good bit on the infrastructure side, and really just worked to absorb the talent of the partners. Everything from proxy fights to credit card fees to cap and trade to, the list goes on from an agriculture and cement and steel perspective. And so I love consulting. I see it as helping people. And I think the public affairs space has changed a lot. There's a view that the inside game is what's important. And so, staying as almost a submerged whale so you don't get harpooned. And what I've seen, having, been in the government and been, kind of out advocating for an industry, is that actually you need to start telling your story on your terms first. That's the cautious approach, being proactive, enabling others to be educated about the benefits that you're bringing to communities. And I think there's a growing recognition of that. I certainly think digital and AI help. And so I'm excited for 2.0 at DCI and really all that the firm has to bring from a growth perspective.
Well, and why did you come back? Why is there a 2.0?
Well, in the energy space, I learned a heck of a lot in onboarding a new CEO and managing through the pandemic and a really challenging policy environment for domestic development in the US with some of the policies coming through. And the tactics and the strategies that were used to keep it in the ground and to push against kind of any development apply not just to oil and gas, but to every energy intensive industry and to healthcare and to financial services and agriculture and transportation. And so I was excited about the opportunity to help companies not just to advocate for issues or fight back against proxies or other pieces like that, but to really tell their story of who they are, what they stand for, how they're shaping the future, and how they're an important part of it. And I think DCI is the best positioned firm to do it. Additionally, I was on the client side and had a bunch of consultants that were supporting the American Petroleum Institute in advocating, but also in their standard setting for the rest of the industry around the world. And, I was impressed with DCI's culture of execution, their campaign style. Oftentimes you're, preparing for board meetings and getting your budgets together and working on some of the infrastructure necessary to make that trade association so strong in advocacy. And DCI was always the one that was out there thinking about what's around the corner and helping us sequence our strategy in order to be successful. And I valued that and wanted to be part of it.
When we talk about public affairs and advising business, has it changed since you started? Definitely.
I think the role of chief communications officer, or corporate affairs officer, even heads of DC office, there's just such an important responsibility to ensure that you're not, that you see outside of the bubble of your industry or your company, and that you can assess the political risk, the regulatory, the legislative risk, that you're looking at some societal changes and how data and digital is evolving, and incorporate that in. See that. Change is the constant here in Washington, as we know, having been here with kind of different administrations back and forth and majority makers switching in Congress. And so I find that really exciting. And the partners at DCI similarly are embracing that change as an opportunity for growth. And
people talk about the challenges, and I got to ask you what the biggest challenges are, but I've also got to ask you, with that change, that constant change has to come constant opportunity as well.
That's right. I definitely. And I think that when you look at what, public affairs was way back when, it was media monitoring, it was kind of, input on the legislative strategy. We are a firm that runs a campaign style approach, but doesn't do political campaigns. We do, issues, and we do companies and trade associations and industries. And I think the way to do that, DCI is long known as sort of a boots on the ground, reach into all 50 states. And with the advent of digital technology and new ways, I mean, you think about this rising generation and just how visual they are. And in crisis communications and other areas like that, just how you have to be ahead from a speed perspective of the media. I mean, we've got a great, talented team that, sometimes these devices are an appendage of them. And so they are, in many ways, the experts in some of these moments. And we've got a real opportunity to harness that, I think, as this kind of unfolds.
Well, and let's go in that direction. What's on the horizon then? When we look at 2025 and beyond, what's coming up for DCI?
I think DCI is more and more heavy in the research space, heavy in the digital and paid media space. But I think even broader, Washington, a lot of businesses and corporations come through Washington. And so as we look at the issues here that impact companies in Houston, Texas, or Portland, Maine, or in Florida or the West Coast, I think what we're seeing is the impact of tax and trade policy. And, we need to be able to make and move things here in America more. We're seeing, a lot of our international competitors, international nations that are not our allies working to crowd America out. And so we have a real opportunity, I think, as a firm to be able to help companies to tell their story and to fight against some of the challenges that come.
You've done really well in this space, so I always like to think, how did people get there? When you first came to DC, was there any particular piece of advice that you thought, and realized now that changed the game for you?
Yes. Dana Perino was the White House press secretary when I was at the White House briefly. And she did, she's a big pull people up by their bootstraps. She's from Colorado. And she did a clinic on minute mentoring late one night at a law firm where she had a bunch of young women. I was in my late 20s and I went. And, we went around and had a couple of minutes with a bunch of women who, were top producers or on-air personalities or were in the West Wing of the White House. And Candy Crowley, a former CNN personality, said, wrap your work around your life and not the other way around. So, that can mean many things, but to me, it meant be intentional about who I was and what I wanted out of life and find a way to integrate my work and my life together and my family and such. And so I've taken that, I've re-given that advice, given her credit, but that's been really, really helpful to me.
You mentioned a number of well-known ladies there. What's it take to be a strong woman in Washington, D.C.?
Great question. I think it takes leadership. I think it takes authenticity. And I think it takes not being afraid to speak up. I think men and women that come to Washington come to make a difference. And they come to really to make a name for themselves. And I think that sometimes you feel like you're standing still and you're not. And so I'm a big fan of getting to know yourself really, really well, and then leveraging that to be a strong leader and speak up for people that aren't able to. I think for young women, one of the things that I'm really passionate about, and I know my other partners, female partners at DCI are tapping women with talent on the shoulder. Sometimes women don't necessarily see themselves in a position of leadership. It's just, this famous imposter syndrome. And so helping them break out of that and remind them and empower them of their talent and their strength, and men too, I think is really important.
Now let me go full circle, just back to the previous question, and that is, if you are giving advice to a young woman now, just starting out in 2024, what's your advice to her?
Two things. First is Doug Goodyear, who's a founder of DCI Group, gave me some great advice when I was starting out. And he said, in your 20s and 30s, lean in to what you're not good at, if you're not a great public speaker, work on it, practice in front of your mirror. If you're not a great writer, DCI is a great environment to learn a lot of that. We have sort of an incubator that brings people up right out of college and puts them on client sites and gives them additional opportunities. Many people who are partners at the firm have come up that way. So, work as hard as you can. Don't be afraid of the grit and the hard work that's needed. Second is Taylor Swift. In her 2022 commencement address, I'm going to be made fun of for saying this, but she was at NYU and she got her doctor or her honorary degree there. And one of the things she said was, there's this false view that you shouldn't be enthusiastic about things, that there's this like, kind of, like blasé way, and I think that you've got to be enthusiastic and want it. If you know what you want to do and you know where you want to get at a company, at a firm here in Washington, work to build a plan to do that. Don't be afraid to be enthusiastic about public affairs or about on-air personalities or about politics, if that's your thing. So they're my 2 pieces of advice.
Meg Bloomgren, thank you very much.
My pleasure, Tim. Thanks for having me.